In this lecture module now, we're going to turn to these two features that have this disproportionate influence on our native inferential and decision-making capacity. So we're going to start by looking at the brain's architecture, and specifically we're going to be looking at working memory in a much more fine-grained way than we have been talking about it earlier. And then we're going to look at how evolution has shaped our inferential strategies, both in terms of the sorts of environments that we were evolving to make inferences in, and the sorts of problems that we were likely making inferences to solve. So we'll start off by looking at working memory and working memory capacity, and we're going to do that by looking at an actual theory from cognitive science about the nature of working memory. And then we're going to focus in on the evolutionary origins of native human inference abilities and talk about how those things shaped both the environments in which humans and proto-humans made inferences and the sorts of problems that they were likely trying to solve. So here's another example of the limited or puny working memory capacity that we have and how it manifests in restrictions on our ability to make inferences. So this is a Where's Waldo picture. And somewhere in here, there is an iconic and very telltale Waldo with his little ski cap on and so on. But when we look at this picture, we can't find Waldo. We have to visually scan that picture in order to try and find where Waldo is. And that's because our working memory capacity, our visual spatial working memory, just cannot hold even a portion of the objects that are in this picture actively in working memory. And so we have to go through the entire picture like a frame at a time, essentially breaking it down in order to try and find that one part of the picture that we want. And that isn't the only manifestation here. Hopefully this comes through on the video, but if you're looking at this picture, it might seem like the arrows are kind of squirming around or moving around, but they aren't. This is a static picture. It isn't an animation. This picture has apparent motion because our brain, again, has a hard time reconciling the various depth cues that are present in the picture. And because it has a hard time recognizing those depth cues, as we shift our attention around the picture, our brain comes up with different interpretations of where the arrows are relative to each other. And these are all manifestations of the limitation of our visual spatial working memory store. So now let's take a look at a little more fine detail at working memory and why it presents us with such a bottleneck for our conscious inference and decision-making capacities. So the model that we're going to be working with is a model that was characterized in a paper by a cognitive scientist named Baddeley in 2003. And he's a major researcher in working memory. So in Baddeley's model, which is called the multi-component model, there are not one, not two, but three different memory stores. So we have the phonological memory store, which stores phonetic and order information. We have the episodic buffer, which serves as a workspace and a scene and event representation memory. And we have the visual spatial sketchpad, which serves to coordinate images of particular objects and properties in visual and spatial orientation. In addition to these buffers, we also have this functional component called the central executive. And the central executive is just what the name suggests. It's a coordinator of information movement and processing within working memory. So our central executive is giving orders and dictating things in all of our working memory stores and in their interrelationships with one another. Now, in addition to having limited capacity, both in terms of amount of information and complexity of information, working memory also has this feature that information will fade unless it's rehearsed in the phonetic store and in the visual spatial sketchpad. And so in the case of the phonological store, that rehearsal is called articulatory rehearsal. That's constantly refreshing information. So if you've ever had to try and remember a number, like 6724, then you'll be rehearsing that number to keep it active in working memory. If you don't focus on rehearsing that and just ignore it for a minute or two, chances are it will decay and you won't be able to remember that number. The visual spatial sketchpad also has a means of refreshing information, and that information will disappear if it's not refreshed. And the visual spatial sketchpad's refreshing mechanism is called the visual and spatial scribes. And essentially these are mechanisms of attentional focus that are moving around the visual scene, refocusing the most sensitive part of our eye, the fovea, putting our visual attention on particular things to refresh them in the visual spatial sketchpad. And you can see information fading from the visual spatial sketchpad if you take a piece of paper and on one side you draw a little X, on the other side you draw a little circle, so that it's just sort of kind of out just barely in your peripheral vision, right? And then you focus on that X, and after a little while what you'll discover is that the circle just disappears because it's not being refreshed, it just fades away. Now, each of these buffers or memory stores in our working memory has access to some form of long-term memory. And conversely, we store information in long-term memory, as we learned in the study habits inventory, by the mechanism of it going through our working memory here. So let's look at each of these components a little more carefully now. So the visual spatial sketchpad stores visual and spatial information. It manipulates that information. For example, when you use visual imagery, you're using your visual spatial sketchpad. It guides motor action using visual and spatial maps. The phonological loop stores phonological and order information. It's implicated in language learning, not surprising. And the amount of information that's stored in the phonological loop is limited to 3 or 4 items, but that's also modulated by the complexity of the items. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Now, the episodic buffer, that third store, it encodes information in a complex multimodal format. So it's combining both the phonological and the visual spatial information. And so it stores this information in this complex multimodal format as scenes or episodes. The episodic buffer facilitates information transfer between long-term memory and working memory. And it transfers and translates information between the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. It's also the place where, when you're trying to operate on information, that's where you're usually relying on the episodic buffer. Finally, we have the central executive, that functional component of the multi-component model, and it directs flow among the components between long-term memory when that relationship between working memory and long-term memory isn't just habitual. It directs attention to specific information, it suppresses distractions, it inhibits inappropriate information and inappropriate actions, it coordinates processing for a task, and it coordinates between tasks when trying to multitask.